If I and he, who is my nephew, were picking a sacred place, this will possibly be it. This is the burial place of our people. This is the burial place of the last of the Gaelic poets of the South East Ulster tradition. From 1480, with the coming of the O'Neills from Tyrone, to present time, this graveyard for 600 years has buried from every section of this community, from all denominations of worship, from all people on all sides of our history, are all buried here together in one space. So for today, we're taking you directly down to the grave of Art McCooey, and McCooey was the last of the Gaelic poets of this area, and anyone who goes to university to study language will hear the story of Art McCooey. So that's where we're heading, and we're going to base our day around McCooey's grave. So Ian and I have a performance piece that we do, and we have brought to in Mocha, where we were the other night, and we've brought it to the Connolly Centre in Belfast. And it is the story of Creggan in stories, in poetry and in music, and that is what we're going to do today. So we are going to do a literary trail, rather than it just be the story of here. We're taking a literary trail, and I suppose part of that trail is to look at why you have some names, both in literary terms and in historical terms, who rise to the top and become very well-known names, and other names which just gently slide away out of the consciousness. And I suppose for many, that's the story of A.E. Russell, that he hasn't the prominence that the other members of the Irish Literary Revival or the Celtic Revival have. He's not seen on the same terms as Yeats. He's not remembered in the same way. So he is almost a forgotten name that needs to be reclaimed. And that is also the case with our women. I don't want to bore you with the aspect of women, but I do intend to keep mentioning it. So we, to get to the literary revival, and that has been a part of how we have viewed our history. We take our history and we cherry pick where we start, which you can't do. Your history ebbs and flows. So to put a context on the literary revival, you have to bring it back to what had happened before that. And the greatest tragedy of Ireland had happened before that. And that was what is described in most of the books that are written as the famine, which is a completely wrong way to determine it, because at the time of the famine, we had a population of 8.18 million, and there was grain in Ireland to feed 18 million. So the words, the Irish language perfectly describes the famine in that it is an Gortha Mór, the great hunger, because we didn't have famine. And many books have been written through the years on the famine. But there are 8 lines of a poem by Jane Wilde, which perfectly describe the famine. Weary men, what reap you? Golden corn for the stranger. What sow you? Hunger-stricken. Fainting forms, hunger-stricken. What see you in the offing? Stately ships to bear our food away, amid the stranger scoffing. There's a proud array of soldiers. What do they round your door? They guard our master's granaries from the thin hands of the poor. Pale mothers, wherefore weeping? Would to God that we were dead, for our children lie before us, and we cannot give them bread. Jane Wilde's poetry is not poetry that is widely recognised. And to take it on to where we're coming to the beginning of the literary revival, where we saw the beginning of different organisations along with that, and one of them being the Land League. And the person that we associate with the Land League is Charles Stewart Parnell and Michael Davitt. We have no stories of Anna Parnell, who founded the Women's Land League, and of Fanny Parnell, her sister, who was the poet. And her poetry, in the words of Michael Davitt, said she was the Marseillaise, or the comic calling to arms of the Irish people to look for their land. And we have totally forgotten it. And by the God who made us all, the landlord and the serf, rise up today and vow to claim your own green Irish turf. Rise up and plant your feet as men, where now you cower a slave, and make the harvest fields your own, or make of them your graves. The women's story central to all of our history.
I'm going to start off with an air that comes from this area. It's composed by a great harp player and composer and songwriter, Molly Nic Fhiodáin, in the 1800s and early 1800s, late 1700s. And she was described by Douglas Hyde in a letter as a reclarsher. And in Old Irish music, there are two kinds of harp. Harps are very, very important to our culture, so much so that it's a national emblem. And the two different kinds of harps, and critch and the clarsach. The critch was seen as a lesser art form of a clarsach. So she was described by Douglas Hyde as a reclarsher, which meant a very important clarsher, and a clarsher was about the best compliment you could get as a harp player. So this tune, Coillte, Glas and Triuca, is a love song that she wrote, and it appeared in the Bunting collection and has kind of gone out of fashion. Hasn't been played much for a long time, but was brought back to I suppose popularity by Patrick Kavanagh and the great work she's been doing in Úirchill Arts. And there's a great website online. If you type in Úirchill Arts, you'll hear all the music and songs from this area. So I suppose Molly Nic Fhiodáin is another woman who has written out of our history and out of our music. So I'm going to try this tune now, and hope you enjoy it. Hope you can hear it okay over there. So.
The question needs to be asked, how could a woman who could compose music like that be forgotten? And that is part of what we need to, and we have been reclaiming. And of the shared history that is in this graveyard, we also have the shared history of the Dakota and the Ojibwe tribe who are here with us, nation who are here with us today. And that is the shared history of colonization. And what that colonial does to your own psyche, and how long it takes you to take your head out of that and to move to the space that creates an independent thinking. Because if we go to any of our major cities, Dublin, second city of the British Empire, you walk down the middle of O'Connell Street in Dublin and you meet statues of men. And underneath all of them are the words that go along with them. No man has a right to change the boundaries of my nation. Things we all learned at school. The greatest quote in Irish history and the most important quote in Irish history came from Anna Parnell, where she said that the greatest of all independence, and no independence will work without it, is the independence of your mind. Of being able to step aside and make your own opinions. And I am privileged to say that I grew up in South Armagh, and that to other people they saw it as people who were contrary and awkward, which we were. But I grew up with a sense of independent thinking in this area that has stood me in good stead, and I can't, has probably only strengthened as I got older. So moving from the Land League to the Irish Literary Revival, and not to forget that in this graveyard we have from both parts of our community people here who are buried from famine times, who are buried from land times. We have the grave of Father Campbell behind me. We have the grave of Reverend Daniel Gunn Brown, the Presbyterian minister, who gave from his own table during the famine, who gave submission to the Devon Commission when he was talking about tenants' rights, and he said the landlords were killers of the people. So, moving to the Irish Literary Revival, which E. Russell was central to. If we take two figures, if we take himself and W.B. Yeats together, 3 years dividing their birth, 4 years dividing their death. One died in 1935, E. Russell died in 1935, and W.B. Yeats died in 1939. Why do we know so much more about W.B. Yeats? Is it because I'm throwing out questions? It's up to yourself to make up your own answers. Is it because W.B. Yeats was of the Anglo-Irish tradition? Because he was a man who viewed himself as being in a higher position, and in our colonial minds, we also viewed him as being of a higher position. I'm not questioning their poetry. I'm questioning why one went up and one didn't. Is it because when the Free State began that W.B. Yeats accepted as senator, and E. Russell said, don't like the way this is going, not going to be a senator? Is it because Russell continued to talk and to challenge for those who were in a lesser position, and also challenged for women, which again is not a story that is much known about him? So we have the poetry of W.B. Yeats, and I'm sure when I say this that there's not one person here, and please do join in, that can't do it. And think about how he viewed Innisfree, a piece of land, but not a piece of land that he needed to work, not a piece of land that he was depending on for his living, so he could be gloriously talking about something because he didn't need it to survive. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-like glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veil of the morning to where the cricket sings, where midnight's all a glimmer, and noon's a purple glow, and evening's full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping along the low side shore. And as I walk the roadway or on the pavement grey, I hear its sound in the deep heart's core. But he didn't have to turn the sod.
I'm going to play a couple of tunes inspired by Yeats. The first one is one that is again another slow tune. Don't know why there's so many slow tunes today, but first one's an air, and it's one that he actually wrote the words to, but inspired on an older air, and it's called Down by the Sally Gardens. I'm sure many of you know it. It's actually inspired on an older air called Rambling Boys of Pleasure, and if you listen to that you'll see a very similar theme and quite a similar melody in places. And then I'll follow it with a tune that was, I suppose, inspired by Yeats. Yeats was of massive inspiration for many of the composers in the 20th century, especially Ed Reevey from Cavan, but this tune here is written by Sean Ryan, a great fiddle player from County Tipperary, and it's called Dooney Rock, and I'd say most certainly inspired by his poem The Fiddler of Dooney. So
do you see, if you join history and stories and poetry and music together, you create magic. If you take history out of the history books and you take it back to what it was, and that was the oral tradition. And we have to come to a place now in our reclamation of our history where we recognise the value of the spoken word and of the oral tradition, and we give it the same recognition as we do to a written story, because generally for the local area, the piece that is your history is the local history that you have been part of and that you have heard from a child and that you need to then hand on. We don't own any of this. This is absolutely no good, any type of reclamation, unless it's handed to the next generation. Now, we have done that. I have to say to you in no sort of a boasting way, South Armagh has done that. We have 6, 7, 8-year-old children leaving this area now, going to Oireachtas, and they are not singing the songs of Donegal or Clare or playing the music of Donegal or Kerry. They are singing and playing the music of their own area. They are singing McCooey's poetry. And this is where we have a living history. So it's no good without it being a living history. So we're going to swing it from Yeats, from the Anglo-Irish man that was Yeats, to the man who just came from across the hills, to Patrick Kavanagh. So Kavanagh born a long time after both A. Russell and Yeats. Kavanagh was born in 1904. He was born in the townland of Mucker in County Monaghan. And his mother, Bridget Quinn, had aspirations. His father was a shoemaker, but his mother, Bridget Quinn, and I think from the psyche in all of our people, they carried the want of land. The loss of land meant that the getting back of land was paramount in all of their thinking. And she didn't want to be a landless person, and she eventually was able to get enough together to buy a farm in the neighbouring townland of Shankill. And she was able to buy the farm because when she went to bid on it, all of the men who were there bidding recognised that it was a harl of rocks and nobody else wanted it. And she didn't have enough knowledge of the land but to not buy it as bad land. So Patrick Kavanagh was first published by A. Russell. 3 of his poems were published in the Irish Statesman of 1929. He had previously submitted work and it had been refused, but A. Russell published for him in 1929. And in 1931, Patrick Kavanagh walked from Monaghan to go to Dublin to meet A. Russell. So A. Russell died in 1935, so it was a short acquaintance, but there is definitely evidence from an oral tradition of how Russell not only supported him in poetry, but also fed him on many occasions when Kavanagh was hungry. And I suppose he didn't live to see, nor did Kavanagh live to see how much would come after Kavanagh. And that if we didn't have Patrick Kavanagh, we couldn't have had Seamus Heaney. So that the ebb and flow is not just history, the ebb and flow is the literature, the acceptance of Kavanagh's work. Now, Kavanagh said that A. Russell was a good and holy man. Now, from a man who had very little good to say about anybody, that's quite a thing for Kavanagh to have said. He wasn't high on the praise end of it. He also, even though his work was banned, a lot of his work was banned at the time, he was fed by Archbishop McCooey, Charles McCooey. And that's a story for another day that we'll just not open today. But Kavanagh's poetry, when you take it against Yeats's poetry, now I'm not in any way trying to knock down W.B. Yeats. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm trying to join things together and look at how poetry is written from different aspects, because I believe no matter how much poetry is universal, there is something in yourself that dictates the way you put your poetry. There's something there that is inherent to you. So Yeats wrote of Innisfree in terms of going for tranquility, in terms of going for what we would have seen this morning of wellness and solitude. Kavanagh wrote about the land that he walked up and down with a plough that was that hilly that you couldn't turn the soil on the harl of rocks. So he spoke about what he knew about. My black hills have never seen the sun rise. Eternally they look north towards Armagh. Lot's wife would not be salt if she had been incurious as my black hills that are happy when dawn whitens Glasdrummin Chapel. My hills hoard the bright shillings of March, while the sun rises in every pocket. They are my Alps, and I have climbed the Matterhorn with a sheaf of hay for 3 perishing calves in the field below the big fort of Rocksavage. This is a man who's writing about what he knows. The sleety winds feather the rushy beards of Shankill, and the cattle drovers sheltering in the Fetterna bush look up and say, who owns them hungry hills? A poet? Then by God he must be poor. I hear, and is my heart not badly shaken?
I'm going to follow that with a few tunes, and the first one is, I suppose, probably the most well-known folk song in Ireland, and the words written by, of course, by Patrick Kavanagh. The Dawning of the Day is the tune, and Raglan Road is, of course, the song. And follow that with a couple of local tunes that have a link to that part of Monaghan and where the three counties of Monaghan, Louth and Armagh meet, which was always known as Farney or the Fadunye. So the first one, the first jig then was composed by Josephine Keegan, great composer from this area, one of Ireland's best known composers, originally from Cremona, just a couple of townlands over that direction, but has lived most of her life in Mullaban. And it's called Humours of Inniskeen, which is very topical considering that's the birthplace of Patrick Kavanagh. And then the last tune is the melody of an Irish song called Cassicán na Fadunye, or the crooked turn in the road at the Fadunye bush, which is just over the road there. And this area here would have been a Gaeltacht up until almost 100 years ago. There were still native speakers. The last native speakers in this area didn't die until the 20s and the 30s. So the Irish isn't that far gone from the area as a continuing language, but it has definitely returned, and this is a song that you'll hear being sung all over Ireland now, and it comes from just over the road. So I'll give this a go.
So I'm moving to E. Russell, and we've already looked at how he became almost a forgotten name. So I've linked Yeats and Kavanagh through land, and I want to link E. Russell back here to Kavanagh, or back here to McCooey, even though he was after the time of McCooey, because I'm going to link it by the Fairy Woman, and one of E. Russell's poems. And I think I love poetry. I think poetry, I think you should go to the poem by the poet that does something for you. that talks to you. So I'm going to a poem of A. Russell's that is very much part of the whole Celtic revival, of the story of the fairy, of the story of going to the other land, to the upper land and the lower land. One of the things when we planted the tree this morning that we should have said was that the tree was sacred to the Celtic people because its roots reached down into the inner world and its branches reached up to the upper world, so it encompasses the two worlds that we live in. So the poem I'm going to do, I'm holding a paper this time because sometimes this one I forget. This poem is called Carrowmore, and it is a fairy poem, a mystical poem, a Celtic poem by A. Russell. It's a lonely road through bogland to the lake at Carrowmore, and a sleeper there lies dreaming as the waters lap the shore. Though the moth wings of the twilight in their purples are unfurled, yet his sleep is filled with music by the masters of the world. There's his hand as white as silver that is fondling in his hair. There are glimmering feet of sunshine that are dancing by him there, and half-open lips of fairy that were dyed a fairy red in their revels where the hazel tree its holy cluster shed. Come away, the red lips whisper, all the world is wakened now. 'Tis the twilight of the ages, and it's time to quit the plough. Oh, the very sunlight's weary ere it lightens up the dew, and its gold is changed and faded before it falls to you. And the great gates of the mountain have opened once again, and the sound of song and dancing falls on the ears of men. And the land of youth lies gleaming, flushed with rainbow light and mirth, and the old enchantment lingers in the honey heart of earth.
So another thing that A. Russell was accredited with and often well known for is designing the flag, which became the Starry Plough and Flying the Stars, which has for the last 100 years been a symbol of Ireland, of the people of Ireland, of the land and of the working class in Ireland. And it's a really, really strong symbol because it connects us with the stars, and it also connects us with the land simultaneously, as the plough here in Ireland and the farmland, especially in rural Ireland. So this is a tune that was actually inspired by a play, so it's kind of a roundabout way, but linked to A. Russell. So this tune is called The Plough and the Stars, and was written by Larry Raglan, a fiddle player and a banjo player who emigrated to America. And he was inspired to write this tune by the play of the same name by Sean O'Casey, who was no doubt inspired by the Easter Rising, the plays about the Easter Rising, and by the Starry Plough, which was one of the main symbols of the Rising. So I'm going to give this a go. It's a nice lively reel for a tune, so a nice lively tune this time.
So just before we finish with E. Russell, maybe that we look at what E. Russell would say now if he were the man who had continued to live but had been the supporter of the poor and supporter of those well less off than themselves. How would he view a colonised people who went on to become colonists in other countries? How would he view us now as a people who accept evictions that were the evictions that were part of the Land League? So we have questions that we need to ask ourselves. Maud Gonne, who was a British socialite, said her world changed when she witnessed the evictions and women and children thrown on the side of the road and cabins burned. That's not any different then than it is now. And we are willing to accept that. How would he view our treatment of a group of people who have been part of this island as long as us in our Irish Travellers? How would he accept what we have done to that? So those are part of, I think, a legacy of the way that E. Russell conducted his own life that we need to now look at our life. And with that, we're bringing it back to our own. So we're at the grave of Art McCooey. McCooey was born here up in the townland of Mount Hill, just up the road. He was born in 1738. He died in 1773, so his life was a short life. And he was born almost 100 years after the O'Neill land had been seized here in South Armagh. During the 17th century, more than 3 million acres of land in Ireland was seized. So the O'Neill land was taken here in the Cromwellian confiscation of 1655. But the tradition of the O'Neills, the strength of the oral tradition of this area, and it's one of the things I think when we talk about the language and the massive revival in the Irish language that there is in this area, I think that for the people who have the Irish, they were lucky because every other part of their culture was still intact for the Irish to slide back into it. The stories, the oral tradition, the sense of place, all of that was part of a feature of this area, and the language just surged it forward, which it has done in the last number of years. But most of McCooey's work looks back to the loss of that Gaelic chieftain, what that would mean to this area, what it would mean, well, financially for himself, because a poet would have gone to the court and be paid to write poetry. But he looked at it in terms of, would it mean the loss of his culture? And his most famous poem is Úirchill on Creggan. And Úirchill on Creggan is a vision poem, an Aisling poem, where the fairy maiden comes to him and tells him to come away, that there's nothing left for him here, which ties it in very nicely to that Celtic poem of E. Russell's. And it is said that McCooey wrote the poem as he sat inside the O'Neill vault around the bones of the Gaelic chieftain who had been displanted and sent away. And he wondered what life was going to be like for himself and for the generations who would come after in South Armagh. On the clay of Creggan graveyard, I slept all night in woe. With rise of morn a maiden came and kissed me bending low. Her cheeks had the blush of beauty, her tresses the golden sheen. 'Twas the world's delight to gaze on the face of that fairy queen. And she bade him to come away, that the Gaelic chieftain had gone, his language would go, his way of living would go. And he says to her, my anguish, my woe, we've lost them, the Gaels of our through to roam, and the heirs to the fews unhonoured sleep under that cold grey stone. Brave branches of Niall Frassic, whose delights were the lays of old, whose hearts give the poets welcome, and whose hands give the poets gold. But she begs him to come with her to Tirnanog, to the land of use, to a place where his life would be better. And he agrees to go with her, but he finishes with, "One thing I ask you only, one promise, O Queen Divine, and I will follow faithful, I'll follow each step of thine. If I should die in some far-off land, in the fragrant clay of Creggan, let my weary heart have rest." So that was our literary trail, joining all of this up together, and I hope, given the way that my mind works sometimes, that it made sense to anyone that was listening to it. But I remember my daddy saying, we were a blessed and lucky people to be born in South Armagh, and I see absolutely nothing that would make me think anything different. We have a heritage and a culture that is absolutely second to none. And we have now come to a realization in our social history to be able to stand firmly and to talk proudly of our origins through poverty, because that was one of the things that stopped us talking. We were afraid to acknowledge we came from poverty. And if you come from poverty, then the other side of that is, why were you poor? Which is back to your story of colonisation and all of the other things that happened. So that's the end of our programme. I'd like to ask E if he will. He composed new music for the Russell Festival, so it would be a nice finish for us here if we heard the tunes that he composed, and then we're all heading back to Coillte. Thank you.
So I'm very lucky to have been asked to create a few tunes for this lovely festival by Patrick and Fergal and Raymond. So many thanks for asking me. I'll explain very briefly the reasoning behind this, because otherwise it will sound very unusual and odd. So I've written three pieces. The first piece is an air called Triuca, which is an Irish saying roughly similar to ebb and flow in English. And I was inspired by a poem that A. Russell wrote called The Tide of Sorrow, where he talks about the inevitability of loss and of sorrow in life. So I'll start with that, and then I'll follow it with two livelier pieces, a kind of slow reel kind of called Moonlight on Slieve Gullion, and then a lively piece to finish with Coillte called Wiley's Loft, which is named after a well-known dance venue years ago, and I could probably tell you more, called Wiley's Loft in Dorsey, just down the road. Okay.
So Wiley's Loft, Wiley's were a Presbyterian family in Dorsey, where my mummy and his granny came from, and my mother was a dancer. She could turn on a sixpence, and I heard her speak repeatedly of the dances on Wiley's Loft. So he has paid tribute back to my mummy and her social history.